Every guide knows the route by heart, and every guide knows the one turn we never take anymore. I should say that differently. Every guide knows the turn is there. We see it. Twice a day, 5 days a week, you walk past it with 35 paying tourists behind you, and you deliver your line about the old plumbing, or the bricked-off section, or whatever version you've settled on that month, and you keep walking. Nobody stops. Nobody asks twice. And you get to the gift shop and you sell them a book about the Great Fire, and they leave happy. But the turn is there, and I need to talk about it because my friend Darcy won't. And the two people who might have backed me up are no longer speaking to each other about anything, and I think that's the point. I think the silence between them is the thing, not what's in the corridor, what happened to the people who went in together and came out unable to agree on what they saw. My name is Colleen. I gave underground tours in Seattle for 3 years, 2021 through 2024. I was never a historian, never an employee of the city. I worked for a private company that licenses the tour route from the property owners beneath Pioneer Square. That's a detail most people don't know. The underground isn't public land. It's a patchwork of basements and sub-basements under privately owned buildings, connected by old sidewalk vaults and service corridors that date back to the 1890s, regrading. The tour company pays access fees to something like 14 different property holders. The route is negotiated annually. It changes slightly from year to year, depending on who renews and who doesn't. I say this because the corridor I'm talking about was on the tour. It was part of the licensed route from at least 2003 through 2019. 16 years. Then it was dropped. The reason on paper is structural assessment. The property owner, I'll call them the Haddock Trust, because I don't want to use the real name, and it doesn't matter, filed a notice with the tour company in late 2019 saying the section needed engineering review. It was pulled from the route. Fine. That happens. Sections rotate in and out for safety, for renovation, for insurance disputes. But the engineering review was never completed. I know this because in 2023, I asked. Not because I was investigating anything, not because I'd had some experience. I asked because Darcy told me a joke. We were closing up after a late Friday tour, October, and she was a little wine-buzzed from the thing we used to do where whoever sold the most guidebooks got a bottle of something from the place on First Avenue. She'd won. She was in a good mood, and she said, apropos of nothing, while we were locking the gate on the Occidental side, "You know they never actually sent an engineer to the Haddock section, right?" I said I didn't know that. She said, "Yeah, Marcy told me. There's no report, there's no assessment. The trust just asked us to stop bringing people through there, and we said okay." I asked why. She said, "Because it's their basement. They don't need a reason." Then she said, and this is the part that stuck, "But if you ever want to walk down there on your own, the lock code is the same as the supply closet. They never changed it." She said it like a dare, like it was funny, and then she kind of stopped smiling and said, "Don't though." I asked her why not, and she said, "Because I did, last March, with Terrance and Gil, and we don't talk about it, like, we literally don't. Terrance won't return my texts." Then she finished her wine and we walked to the bus. I need to give you a sense of the underground before I go any further, because the way most people imagine it is wrong. It's not a tunnel system, it's not catacombs, it's not a continuous underground city stretching beneath Seattle like some subterranean mirror. It's fragments, disconnected basements, some of which have been reconnected by knocking through walls. Old sidewalk-level storefronts that became subterranean when the city raised the street grade by 1 to 2 full stories after the 1889 fire. In most places, you're standing in what used to be the ground floor of a building, looking up at glass prisms in what used to be the sidewalk and is now the ceiling. It's touristy. It's well lit, mostly. There are exposed brick walls and old signage and the remnants of bathrooms that haven't worked since Prohibition. The tour guides make jokes. People take photos that don't turn out well because of the lighting. It's fun. I liked the job. The Haddock section was different from the rest of the route. Not dramatically, not in the way that would make a good campfire story. It was different in the specific, boring way that matters. The section ran under a building on the south end of the square, near King Street, and unlike most of the tour-accessible underground, it went deeper. Not metaphorically, physically. There was a set of stairs, 12 steps I was told, though I never counted them myself, that took you down to a sub-basement level that was roughly 8 to 10 feet below the standard underground floor. This was unusual. Most of the underground is 1 story below current street level. The Haddock section was 2. The tour used to bring people down those stairs, show them a room with some old fixtures, a cast iron boiler mount, some early electrical conduit, and then bring them back up. It was a 3-minute addition to the route. The guides used it to talk about the layered construction of Pioneer Square, how some buildings had basements beneath their basements, how the city was essentially a palimpsest. I learned all of this from training materials and from older guides. I never walked the Haddock section with tourists. By the time I started, it had been off route for 2 years. But I thought about what Darcy said. Not right away, not obsessively. I thought about it the way you think about something when a friend tells you a half story and then seals it. You're not consumed. You're just aware of a shape you can't finish. 2 weeks later, I ran into Gil. Gil had been a guide for about 8 years, semi-retired now. He picked up shifts when he wanted, mostly summer weekends. I'd overlapped with him only a few times. He was older, early 60s, had a background in community theater, and gave what were honestly the best tours of anyone on staff. Warm, funny, knew how to hold a room, or a tunnel, I guess. I saw him at a coffee shop near the ferry terminal. We talked for a few minutes. I didn't plan to bring it up, but I did, because I'm like that. I said Darcy had mentioned the Haddock section, and that the 3 of them had gone down there. Gil's face did something I want to describe precisely because I think it matters. He didn't go pale, he didn't flinch. What he did was become very still in a way that I associate with someone deciding in real time how much trouble the truth is going to cause. It was the face of someone calculating. Then he said, "Darcy told you we went in?" I said yes. He said, "What else did she tell you?" I said nothing, just that they'd gone in and that Terrance wasn't speaking to her. Gil nodded slowly. Then he said, "Terrance isn't speaking to me either." I waited. He said, "We disagree about what happened down there, not in a dramatic way, he paused. In a factual way. We disagree about the physical space." I asked what he meant. He said, "Darcy says the corridor past the boiler room goes left. Terrance says it goes right. I say it goes straight." I almost laughed. I didn't because of his face. I said, "You're telling me 3 people walk through the same hallway and can't agree on which direction it turned?" He said, "I'm telling you 3 people walk through the same hallway and none of us are lying." He finished his coffee and said he had to go. At the door, he stopped and said one more thing. He said, "The other thing is that it's too long. However you measure it, it's too long. All 3 of us agree on that." Then he left. I want to be careful here about how I frame what happened next, because I don't want to sound like someone building a case. I wasn't building anything. I was a 27-year-old tour guide with a comparative literature degree and a curiosity problem, and I had just been told something that didn't make sense in a way that felt specific enough to be real. Hallways go in one direction. 3 sober adults can agree on which direction a hallway turns. The fact that they couldn't wasn't spooky to me at that point. It was irritating. It was a puzzle that shouldn't have been a puzzle. So I did what I think most people would do. I decided I'd go look for myself. Not right away. I needed the lock code, which I got from the supply closet keypad. Darcy was right. They were the same. A 4-digit code that I won't share here. I needed a flashlight, which I had, and I needed a day when I'd be the last one closing up, and could plausibly be in the underground alone for an extra 20 or 30 minutes without anyone wondering. That day came on a Tuesday in early November, 2023. I closed the last tour at 6:40 p.m. The other guide that day, a newer guy named Pete, left by 7. I told him I was going to double-check the gate on the south section because someone had reported the latch sticking. He didn't care. He wanted to get home. By 7:15, I was standing at the entrance to the Haddock section. Let me describe what this looks like from the tour route. There's a point on the standard path, about 2/3 of the way through, where you pass through a brick archway into a wider room. This used to be the basement of a hardware store, and there are still shelves bolted into the walls. On the far side of this room, there's a corridor that continues to the next section of the tour, and on the left wall, there's a steel door with a padlock hasp. Not remarkable. There are doors like this throughout the underground. Some are locked permanently. Some open into mechanical spaces for the buildings above. Some are just bricked up on the other side. This one had a combination padlock. Modern. The kind you'd buy at a hardware store for a gym locker. It was almost aggressively ordinary. I entered the code. It opened. Behind the door was a short passage, maybe 6 feet, that opened into a room I recognized from the old training photos. The boiler room. Cast iron mount still there, bolted to a brick plinth. Old conduit running along the ceiling. Some debris on the floor. Plaster. A few bricks. Nothing unusual. It smelled like mineral dust and cold stone, which is exactly what every room in the underground smells like. At the back of the boiler room, there was a set of stairs going down, 12 steps. I counted because Gil had mentioned 12. They were concrete, poured directly onto what I assumed was compacted fill beneath the original basement floor. The walls on either side were rough, not finished brick like upstairs, but exposed aggregate with patches of something that looked like lime plaster or early Portland cement. It was older down here, obviously, visibly older. At the bottom of the stairs, there was a corridor. And here's where I need to be very precise. The corridor went straight. It went straight for what I estimated was about 40 feet. And at the end, there was a wall, not a door, not a turn, a wall, brick, old, undisturbed. I walked the length of it. I touched the end wall. I shined my flashlight on it, solid, no gaps, no seams suggesting a doorway that had been filled in. Just wall. Total elapsed time from door to wall and back. Maybe 4 minutes. I went back up, locked the padlock, and left. That night, I texted Darcy. I said I'd gone in. I said it went straight and ended at a wall. I asked what she meant about it going left. She didn't respond for 2 days. When she did, she sent one message. There's no wall. I said there was. I said I touched it. She said, I was down there for 35 minutes. It doesn't end. I assumed she was messing with me, or that her memory was off, or that there was some other corridor I'd missed, a side passage, a branch I hadn't noticed. I'd been focused on the main axis. I could have missed something in the dim light. So I went back. The following Tuesday, same routine, closed up, waited for the other guide to leave, let myself in. Same padlock, same boiler room, same 12 stairs, same corridor. Straight, 40 feet, wall. But this time, I was methodical. I walked slowly. I kept my flashlight on the left wall, then turned around and came back, keeping it on the right wall. I was looking for any opening, any recess, any doorway I might have missed. There was nothing. Both walls were continuous, rough, old, unbroken. I stood at the dead end again. Same wall. I knocked on it, solid. I pressed my ear against it. Nothing. I took a photo with my phone. I checked the time. 7:38 p.m. I took another photo from the top of the stairs, looking down the corridor toward the wall. I left. When I got home, I looked at the photos. The corridor in the photos was straight and ended in a wall, exactly as I'd seen it. But there was a detail I hadn't registered in person that the camera had caught in a way I couldn't explain. The far wall, the dead-end wall, had a shadow on it. Not my shadow. My flashlight was behind me, pointed forward. My shadow would have been cast onto the far wall, but it would have been a silhouette of me projected from behind. What was on the wall in the photo was a shadow falling from the left side, as if there were a light source to the right of the frame, casting something shadow laterally across the bricks. There was no light source to the right. There was only the right wall. I zoomed in. The shadow was angular, vertical, with a horizontal component near the top, like the shadow of an open door frame, cast sharply, as if by a nearby point source. There was no door frame. I looked at the photo from the top of the stairs. Same corridor, longer view. No shadow visible from that distance. Just bricks. I want to be measured about this. I know how phone cameras work in low light. I know about JPEG compression artifacts, about lens flare, about how a flashlight beam in a dusty environment can create strange contrast effects at the edge of its throw. I considered all of that. I'm not a photographer. I'm not qualified to say definitively that what I saw in that image was impossible. But I saved it, and I compared it to the first photo from the week before. The first photo, same wall, same flashlight, nearly the same angle, had no shadow. I texted Gil. I didn't tell him what I'd seen. I just asked him, as precisely as I could, to describe the corridor he remembered, length, direction, features. He responded that evening. He said, "Straight about 100 feet, concrete floor, ends at a metal door." I said the corridor was 40 feet and ended at a brick wall. He said, "No, it was long. I walked it for at least a minute. There's a door at the end with a wheel handle like a bulkhead. 100 feet. A metal door with a wheel handle. I had walked a 40-foot corridor that ended in old brick, twice. I called Darcy. She picked up, which surprised me. She was quiet when I told her what I'd found and what Gil had said. Then she told me her version. Darcy said the corridor, after about 20 feet, turned left into a wider passage with a lower ceiling. She said she followed it for maybe 10 minutes. She said the walls changed from brick to stone, large cut stone blocks like foundation work. She said there were wooden shelves along one wall with glass jars on them, empty, and that the air changed from dry to damp. She said the passage eventually opened into a small room with a drain in the center of the floor and a second exit on the opposite wall that she did not go through. She had been in there for 35 minutes. I asked why she hadn't gone through the second exit. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Because I could hear someone on the other side, not moving, just standing there, breathing, I asked her if she told Gil and Terrance about the breathing. She said, "That's the thing. We went in together. All three of us, at the same time. We walked down those stairs side by side, and then—" She paused. "We weren't together anymore." She said she didn't see them leave. She didn't see them take a different path. She was walking next to Gil, and then she was walking alone in a corridor that turned left. When she came back up the stairs, 12 steps, same as everyone, Gil and Terrance were already in the boiler room. They'd been waiting for her. They said she'd been gone for 10 minutes. She said it was 35. Gil said the corridor was straight and long and ended at a metal door. Terrance said the corridor turned right, descended slightly, and opened into a low-ceilinged room with what he described as a stone trough running along the floor, fed by a pipe in the wall that was dry but stained with something dark and mineral-smelling. Darcy said it went left, with shelves and jars and a room with a drain and someone breathing. 3 people, same door, same stairs, same 12 steps down. 3 completely different spaces. I started pulling what records I could. Not because I had a theory, I didn't, but because the physical contradiction was so specific and so calmly reported by 3 people I trusted that I felt like I needed to ground it in something material. The Haddock Trust, as I mentioned, is the property holder. The building above the section is a mixed-use commercial space, a ground-floor restaurant that's changed hands several times, offices on the upper floors. The trust has held the property since 1961. Before that, the building was owned by a family named Engstrom, who operated a dry goods business on the ground level from 1904 through the mid-1950s. The underground section beneath this building was part of the original post-fire reconstruction. After the 1889 fire, the city raised the grade of the streets, and what had been ground floors became basements. The Engstrom building was one of several that were constructed with deep foundations, unusually deep for the area, which is reclaimed tidal flat. The soil composition down near Elliott Bay is mostly fill-over mud over clay, and deep foundations in that part of Pioneer Square in the 1890s were expensive and uncommon. Most buildings in the neighborhood sit on wooden pilings driven into the mud. The Engstrom building has a stone foundation that goes down further than the neighboring structures. I found this in a 1987 engineering survey that was part of a seismic retrofit assessment for the block. It's public record. The survey notes that the Engstrom building, identified by its parcel number, has a sub-basement level of indeterminate extent, access not granted by current property holder. The surveyors were unable to complete their assessment of the foundation depth. The trust declined access. That phrase, indeterminate extent, is the one that kept me up. Not because it's sinister, because it's precise. An engineer wrote that. An engineer looked at the available evidence for how deep this foundation goes and could not determine where it ended. I also found the 2019 correspondence between the Haddock Trust and the tour company. This took some doing. I asked a former manager who still had files from the route negotiation process, and she was willing to share the relevant letter because she thought the whole thing was a routine liability issue. The letter is 1 page. It's from an attorney representing the trust. It does not mention structural concerns. It does not mention an engineering review. It says, "The trust requests that the licensed tour route exclude the sub-level section of the property, effective immediately. This request is made at the trust's sole discretion pursuant to Section 4C of the Access Agreement and does not require cause." It doesn't say why. The tour company's internal response, which the former manager showed me in an email chain, says, "Fine, we'll reroute around it, not worth the argument." Nobody argued. Nobody asked. A section of the tour that had been walked by thousands of tourists for 16 years was quietly closed, and no one thought twice. I went back a third time, late November 2023. I brought a measuring tape, my phone with the camera, and a notebook. Same routine, same padlock, same boiler room, same 12 stairs. The corridor was different. Not dramatically, not in a way that would let me say with certainty that I was looking at a different physical space. But the wall, the dead-end wall that I had touched twice before, was further away. I measured from the bottom step to the far wall. 53 feet. The first 2 visits, I had estimated 40. I hadn't measured, but I'm 5'6" and I'd paced it, and 40 feet was my confident approximation. 25 to 27 of my steps. This time, I counted 34 steps, 53 feet with the tape. The wall was the same brick, same mortar, same flat, unbroken surface. But it was 13 feet further away than it had been 2 weeks earlier. I took photos. I took them systematically, one every 10 feet from the stairs. I took one of the far wall. I took one of each side wall at the halfway point. I sat down on the floor about 30 feet in and turned off my flashlight. I want to describe this carefully. The underground in Seattle is not silent. You can hear the city above, muffled footsteps, the bass thrum of traffic, the occasional vibration from a heavy vehicle. In most sections, you can hear water moving somewhere, condensation dripping, or the old drainage system doing whatever it still does. There's always a hum. It's not quiet. The Haddock corridor was quiet, not reduced noise quiet. Quiet in the way that a room is quiet when it's been insulated against sound. When I turned off my flashlight, I could hear my own breathing, my own heartbeat, the rustle of my jacket when I shifted. But nothing from above, no traffic, no water, no hum. And then, and I need to be honest about the limits of what I'm reporting here, I heard something I cannot confidently identify. It was rhythmic, soft, coming from the direction of the far wall. It was not mechanical. It did not sound like dripping or tapping, or any of the standard underground noises I'd spent 3 years learning to tune out. The closest analogy I can offer is that it sounded like someone turning pages, not reading aloud, just turning pages. That dry, soft, fibrous sound of paper being lifted and laid down. It lasted about 15 seconds. Then it stopped. I turned my flashlight back on. The corridor was the same. The wall was the same. I walked to the wall and pressed my ear against it. Nothing. I left, locked the padlock, went home. The photos from that third visit were the ones that finally made me feel like I was dealing with something I couldn't file under low-light artifacts. I'd taken 6 photos total. The ones from the corridor looked normal. The one of the far wall did not. The shadow was back. Same angular shape, like a door frame casting a shadow from a light source that wasn't there. But this time, it was on the other side of the wall. In the first anomalous photo, the shadow fell from the left. In this one, it fell from the right, as if the phantom light source had moved. And there was something else. In the upper left corner of the frame, near where the wall met the ceiling, there was a dark area that didn't correspond to anything I'd seen in person. Not a shadow. A gap. The photo showed what appeared to be a space, an opening, maybe 10 inches wide, between the top of the brick wall and the ceiling. I had been standing 5 feet from that wall with a flashlight. There was no gap. I would have seen it. The brick went flush to the ceiling. But the camera showed otherwise. I did not go back to the Haddock section for 3 months. This was not because I was frightened. I want to be precise about my emotional state, because I think it matters for understanding what happened later. I was not afraid, and I was confused in a way that felt like it had a bottom, like if I just found the right piece of information, the confusion would resolve into something explicable. Bad surveying, optical illusions, humidity affecting the brick, phone camera malfunctions. I kept reaching for rational explanations, not because I was in denial, but because the rational explanations were genuinely plausible, individually. It was only collectively that they started to strain. What kept me away was Darcy. After my third visit, I'd called her to describe what I'd found: the measurements, the shadow, the sound, the gap in the photo. She'd listened without interrupting. When I finished, she said, "You need to stop going down there." I asked why. She said, "Because it's learning what you expect to see." I didn't know what to do with that. I asked her to explain. She said, "Gil expected something industrial. He got a long, straight corridor with a metal door. Terrance expected something historical. He got a stone trough. I expected—" She stopped. Then, I expected something domestic. I got shelves with jars, a room that felt like a root cellar. She said, "You expect something measurable, something you can document, something that holds still long enough to be photographed, and each time you go down, it gives you a little more of that. A shadow you can zoom in on, a measurement that's slightly off, a sound you can almost identify." I said that was not a thing that corridors do. She said, "No, it isn't." Then she said, "The last time I talked to Terrance, the actual last time before he stopped answering, he told me he'd gone back alone, twice. And the second time, the trough had water in it." I asked what kind of water. She said, "He said warm. He said it was warm and moving, like it was being circulated, and he put his hand in it." I asked what happened. She said, "Nothing. Nothing happened. His hand got wet. He dried it off on his pants. He came back up. But he said it felt like the corridor was satisfied." That's the word he used. Satisfied. Like he'd done the thing it was waiting for him to do. And then he stopped talking to both of them. I thought about this conversation constantly over the next 3 months, not with dread, with a specific, focused kind of frustration that I recognize now as the feeling of being presented with a problem that doesn't want to be a problem. Darcy's explanation, that the corridor adapted to the expectations of whoever entered it, was not an explanation. It was a description dressed up as a theory. It didn't tell me what the corridor was. It didn't tell me why 3 people experienced 3 different physical spaces. It didn't tell me how a brick wall could be 13 feet further away on a 3rd visit than a 1st. What it told me was that Darcy had stopped trying to understand and had started trying to manage. She had a framework. The corridor learns, the corridor gives you what you expect, and the framework let her stop asking questions. It was a coping mechanism shaped like an answer. I didn't want to cope. I wanted measurements. In February 2024, I went looking for Terrance. This was harder than it should have been. Terrance had been a guide for about 4 years before I started. He'd left the company in mid-2023, not dramatically, just stopped picking up shifts. Gil had his number, but Terrance wasn't answering. Darcy had an old email address. I tried it. No response. I found him through a mutual acquaintance, another former guide named Heather, who'd moved to Tacoma. She said Terrance was working at a bookstore in Ballard. She gave me the name. I went. It was a small, used bookstore on a side street off Market. Terrance was behind the counter. He was younger than I'd expected. Early 30s, thin, with a nervous energy that might have always been there, or might have been new. I didn't know him well enough to judge. I introduced myself. I said I was a current guide and that I knew about the Haddock section. I said I'd been down there. He looked at me for a long time. Then he said, "Which way did it go?" I said, "Straight, dead end, brick wall." He said, "Did you touch the wall?" I said, "Yes." He said, "Don't do that again." I asked why. He said, and again, I'm trying to be as precise as I can with his words, "Because the wall isn't the end. The wall is the part of it that faces you. When you touch it, you're not touching a wall. You're touching the outside of something." I asked him what he meant. He held up his hand, the one he'd put in the warm water, though I didn't know which hand that was. It looked normal, no marks, no discoloration, nothing visible. He said, "I can feel it in my fingers, not pain, not temperature, like a texture that isn't there, like my hand remembers touching something that my skin can't identify." He said, "It started after the water. It's been 8 months. It hasn't changed. It hasn't gotten worse. It's just present. Like a word you can't remember, but you can feel the shape of." I asked him why he stopped talking to Gil and Darcy. His answer was the thing that changed my understanding of the situation entirely. He didn't say he was angry. He didn't say he was scared. He said, "Because we can't agree on what's down there, and every time we talk about it, our versions get further apart." I asked what he meant, further apart. He said, "The first time we compared notes, right after, that same night, the differences were small. My corridor went right, Darcy's went left, Gil's went straight. Same basic shape, same general size, like we'd each walked a slightly different version of the same space." He said, "But a week later, when Darcy called me to talk about it again, her version had changed. The shelves were longer. The jars had things in them. The room at the end had details she hadn't mentioned before. A chair, she said. A wooden chair near the drain. She was sure it had been there the first time, but she hadn't mentioned it because she'd been focused on the breathing sound." He said, "And my version had changed too. The trough was longer. The ceiling was lower. There were marks on the walls I hadn't noticed before, but that I was now sure I'd seen." Our memories were diverging, not fading, growing, getting more detailed over time, but in different directions. He said, "That's why I stopped talking to them. Every conversation made it worse. Every time we compared, the differences multiplied. It was like the corridor was still building itself inside our heads, and every time we talked, we gave it new material." I sat with Terrance for about an hour. He was calm. He wasn't performing distress. He was describing something he'd thought about carefully and reached a conclusion about that he didn't like, but had accepted. Before I left, I asked him one more thing. I asked him if he'd ever looked at photos he'd taken down there. He said he hadn't taken any. I asked if he wanted to see mine. He said no, firmly. He said, "Don't show those to anyone who's been down there. Don't compare notes. Don't tell Gil what I told you. Don't tell Darcy what I told you. Every point of contact is a point of growth." I said I didn't understand what was growing. He said, "The corridor." He said, "Not the physical one, the one in your head, the one you started building when you went down those stairs the first time. It's not done. It won't be done until you stop feeding it information." Then he asked me, quite gently, to leave. I spent the next month not going to the Haddock section and not contacting anyone about it. I worked my shifts. I gave my tours. I walked past the steel door with the padlock, and I delivered my line about old plumbing, and I kept walking. But Terrance was wrong about one thing. or at least incomplete. He said every conversation made the versions diverge further. He said contact was the mechanism of growth. But I hadn't spoken to anyone about the corridor for 4 weeks, and my version was still changing. Not my memory of the corridor itself, that stayed fixed. 40 feet the first 2 times, 53 the third time. Wall, shadow, sound of pages, gap in the photo. Those details didn't shift. What changed was the space around them, the context. I started dreaming about the boiler room, not the corridor, the boiler room, the room at the top of the 12 stairs. And in the dreams, the boiler room had details I hadn't noticed during my visits, but that I was now certain were real. A pipe along the south wall with a brass valve. A square patch of newer concrete on the floor near the stair opening, about 2 feet by 2 feet, like something had been filled in. A smell of lye. Were those things actually in the boiler room? I didn't know. I hadn't been paying close attention to the boiler room. I'd been focused on the stairs, the corridor, the wall. But the details felt real. They had the weight and texture of memory, not imagination. And they were specific in a way that my dreams usually aren't. I don't normally dream in brass valves and concrete patches. I recognized what was happening. I recognized it because Terrance had described it. The corridor, or whatever the corridor was part of, was still elaborating inside me. It was adding detail, filling in spaces I'd walk through quickly, furnishing rooms I'd barely glanced at. And I hadn't been back. I hadn't talked to anyone. The process didn't need external input. It just needed the initial visit. In late March 2024, I did something I probably shouldn't have. I went to see the Haddock Trust. Not the trust itself. A trust isn't a person. But the registered agent was listed in public property records. The agent was a law firm in Bellevue, a small office handling estates and property management. I called and said I was inquiring about the Pioneer Square property. I gave the parcel number and asked to speak with whoever managed the trust's affairs. The receptionist was polite. She put me on hold. A man came on the line. He gave his name, which I won't repeat here. He asked what my inquiry was regarding. I said I was a tour guide with the company that had previously licensed access to the sub-basement level of the property, and that I was wondering about the status of the engineering review. There was a pause. Then he said, "What engineering review?" I said the section had been pulled from the tour route in 2019 for a structural assessment. He said, "That's not accurate. The trust requested the section be removed from the tour because it's no longer appropriate for public access. There was no engineering review requested or conducted." I said I understood. I asked why it was no longer appropriate. He said, "I'm not going to discuss the trust's property management decisions with a tour operator. Is there anything else?" I said, "Has anyone from the trust been in the sub-basement recently?" Another pause. Longer. He said, "The trust maintains the property. That's all I can tell you." I said, "How deep does the sub-basement go?" He said, "I think we're done here," and hung up. The call lasted less than 3 minutes. He hadn't told me anything. But the rhythm of his responses told me something. The first pause, after I mentioned the engineering review, was surprise. He hadn't expected me to know about the section, or he hadn't expected a tour guide to call. The second pause, after I asked if anyone had been in the sub-basement, was not surprise. It was decision-making. He knew the answer. He chose not to give it. I went back down in April. I need to tell you that I understood, at this point, that I was doing something that multiple people had told me not to do. Darcy had told me to stop. Terrance had told me not to touch the wall, not to share information, not to feed it. The attorney had been uninterested in helping. I had my own evidence that the space was behaving in a way I couldn't explain, and every rational instinct I had said that when you don't understand something, the correct response is not to increase your exposure to it. I went anyway. I won't pretend this was courage or intellectual rigor. It was the same thing that makes people pick at scabs. The not knowing was worse than the knowing might be. Same routine, Tuesday closing shift, padlock, boiler room. The boiler room had the brass valve, south wall, exactly where my dream had placed it. It had the concrete patch, near the stair opening, 2 feet by 2 feet. I stood there for a long time, looking at these details that I had not consciously noticed on 3 prior visits, but that my sleeping mind had apparently recorded and replayed with perfect fidelity, or that had appeared since my last visit, or that had been placed there by my expectation of finding them. I couldn't determine which explanation was true. Any of the 3 was possible. None of the 3 was acceptable. I went down the 12 stairs. The corridor was straight. The wall was there, but the corridor was longer. I didn't measure this time. I didn't need to. It was obviously, visibly longer, 80 feet at least, maybe more. The far wall was at the limit of my flashlight beam. I could see it, but just barely. A flat plane of brick catching the light at the edge of visibility. I walked toward it, slowly, counting steps, listening. At around the 40-foot mark, where the wall had been on my first 2 visits, I stopped. There was nothing there. No seam, no mark, no indication that a wall had ever stood in this spot. Just continuous corridor, stretching ahead. I kept walking. At around 60 feet, I heard the sound again, pages turning, closer now. Not from the wall, but from somewhere above me and to the right, as if it were coming through the ceiling. I stopped and listened. It continued for about 10 seconds. Then it stopped. I looked at the right wall with my flashlight. The wall was unchanged. Brick, old mortar, continuous. But there was a mark on it that I hadn't seen before. It was at about chest height, and it was not a crack or a stain or a watermark. It was a line. A single horizontal line, maybe 18 inches long, scored into the brick surface with something sharp. It was clean, precise, intentional. Below it, about 4 inches down, was another line. Same length, same precision. Below that, another. 5 lines total, evenly spaced, horizontal, scored into the brick, like someone had stood in this exact spot and deliberately marked the wall. I touched the top line with my index finger. The groove was shallow, maybe a 1/16 of an inch deep. The edges were sharp. This had been done with a tool, not a fingernail. Terrance's words came back to me. "Don't touch the wall." I pulled my hand back, but I'd already touched it. On 3 previous visits, I'd touched the far wall. What was one more surface? I kept walking. The far wall was close now. I could see individual bricks, same as always, old, flat, continuous. I reached it. I stood in front of it. I did not touch it. I turned around and looked back the way I'd come. The corridor stretched away from me, the stairs barely visible as a faint gray rectangle at the far end, lit by whatever ambient light leaked down from the boiler room. And there was someone standing at the halfway point. I need to describe this carefully, because I have spent a long time thinking about what I saw, and I am still not confident in my description. There was a figure. It was not between me and the light. It was to the side, near the right wall, partially in shadow. It was standing still. It was the size and proportion of a person. I could not see features. I could not determine if it was facing me or facing away from me. It was there for the duration of one breath, mine, and then it was not there. I did not run. I walked back down the corridor at a pace that I am sure was faster than my walk-in, but I did not run. I passed the point where the figure had been. There was nothing, no one. The corridor was empty. The 5 lines on the right wall were still there. I reached the stairs and went up and crossed the boiler room and went through the steel door and locked the padlock and walked through the underground to the exit and went outside into the rain on Occidental Avenue. It was 8:20 p.m. I had been in the corridor for approximately 35 minutes. On my first visit, the same corridor, 40 feet wall to wall, had taken 4 minutes. I sat on a bench in Occidental Square for a long time. My hands were steady. My breathing was normal. I was not panicking. I was doing something that felt worse than panicking. I was revising my understanding of a place I had visited 4 times, and each revision made the previous version less real. The corridor was not a fixed space. Every person who entered it experienced a different configuration. Every subsequent visit produced a longer, more detailed version. The phenomenon was cumulative and individualized. It did not require conversation or comparison to progress. It operated on the interior architecture of the visitor's expectations and grew from there. And I had seen someone, or I had seen something that looked like someone, or I had seen the shadow of something that the corridor had assembled from materials I didn't know I was providing. I resigned from the tour company 2 weeks later, not because of the corridor, or not entirely. I was moving on. I'd been accepted to a graduate program in Portland, and the timing was right. My last day was in late April. I gave my final tour, walked past the steel door one last time, and didn't look at it. But before I left, I did one more thing. I went to the county records office and pulled the complete permit history for the Haddock Trust parcel. Every building permit, every inspection record, every complaint and variance and utility connection, back to 1904. Most of it was unremarkable. Routine maintenance, a roof replacement in 1978, electrical upgrade in 1992, seismic bolts in 2001, normal building stuff. But there was a sequence of entries from 1947 through 1953. 6 permits filed annually, each for maintenance of subgrade storage facility. Different contractor each year, all approved without inspection. The work area square footage was listed as to be determined upon completion. How do you file a permit for a work area whose square footage hasn't been determined? How does that get approved 6 times? After 1953, the permits stop. There are no further subgrade maintenance records for the parcel. Whatever was being maintained, either the maintenance ended or it stopped requiring permits. Or it stopped requiring the pretense of permits. I'm in Portland now. I started my program last fall. I don't give tours anymore. I haven't been to Pioneer Square since I left Seattle. But here's the thing I need to say. The reason I'm telling this to strangers, instead of keeping it sealed the way Terrance wanted, the way Darcy has, the way Gil seems to have. The corridor is not in Seattle. I don't mean that metaphorically. I mean that what's under the Haddock Trust building is not a corridor in the way that a hallway in your house is a corridor, a fixed space with fixed dimensions between fixed walls. What's down there is something that uses the form of a corridor, the way a question uses the form of a sentence. It's not the space. It's the shape the space takes when someone enters it. And it's in my head now, not as a memory. Memories are fixed, or they degrade. This does not degrade. It elaborates. I can close my eyes right now in my apartment in Portland, 170 miles from Pioneer Square, and I can walk the corridor. It starts at the top of the 12 stairs. It goes down, it goes straight, and it keeps going. Every week, it's a little longer. The details are always new. I pass the 5 scored lines on the right wall. Those are fixed, those stay, and beyond them there are things I haven't seen before. A recess in the left wall with a wooden frame, like a doorway that was never completed. A change in the floor surface from concrete to stone. A widening, a narrowing, a sound that I can't identify because it's not a sound I've ever heard in the physical world. I have not gone back. I want to be clear about that. I have not visited the Haddock section since April 2024. What I'm describing is happening inside my head, in the space between sleep and waking, in the moments when I close my eyes and stop directing my thoughts. The corridor builds itself. I don't choose to walk it. I just find myself there. And here is the part that I haven't told anyone, the part that made me decide I needed to say this publicly to people who haven't been down those stairs and are never going to go down those stairs. Last month, March 2025, I was walking the corridor in one of these involuntary episodes, late at night, lying in bed with my eyes closed. I had gone further than usual, past the 5 lines, past the uncompleted doorway, past the stone floor section, into an area that was new, that I'd never seen or imagined. The ceiling was higher here. The walls were rougher, less finished, more like excavated earth shored up with timber. It felt old in a way that the upper sections don't, old like geology, not architecture. And I came around a turn, the first turn I had ever encountered in my version of the corridor, and there was a room. Small, maybe 8 by 10 feet, low ceiling, dirt floor. There were glass jars on wooden shelves along the left wall. There was a stone trough along the right wall with a pipe in the back, dry but stained. And at the far end, there was a metal door with a wheel handle. Darcy's corridor, Terrance's corridor, Gil's corridor. They were all there, together, connected, as if they'd been building toward each other this whole time and had finally met inside my head. I opened my eyes. I was in my apartment. It was 3 a.m. I was crying, and I didn't know why, not from fear, from something else, from the recognition that the corridor was not 4 separate things. It was one thing, experienced in fragments, and the fragments were converging. I called Darcy the next morning, first time we'd spoken in months. I told her what I'd seen. She was quiet for a very long time. Then she said, "I know, mine too. I reached a straight corridor 3 weeks ago, long, concrete, with a metal door at the end." She said, "Gil called me last week. He'd found the jars." I asked about Terrance. She said, "I don't know. He still won't talk to us." Then she said something that I have not been able to stop thinking about. She said, "Colleen, what happens when all 4 corridors finish building? What happens when all of us have the complete version?" I didn't have an answer. She said, "I think it opens." I said, "What opens?" She said, "The door, the one with the wheel handle, Gil's door. I think when all 4 of us can see the whole thing, when the corridor is complete in all of us, I think the door opens." I said, "Opens where?" Darcy said, "Down." We are not in contact with Terrance. His phone number is disconnected. The bookstore in Ballard says he left last fall. Heather doesn't know where he went. He is the 4th. His version has the trough, the water, the warmth. If his corridor is growing the way ours are, and there's no reason to think it isn't, Then he's building toward the rest of us right now, wherever he is. I don't know what happens when it's complete. I don't know what complete means in a space that only exists inside 4 people's heads. But I know the door is there. I can see it every night now, at the end of the full corridor, waiting. I know the wheel handle. I know its weight, even though I've never touched it. I know it turns counterclockwise. I know this with the same certainty I know my own middle name, and I have never put my hands on that handle, and I do not know how I know which way it turns. The padlock is still on that steel door in the underground, the same 4-digit code. The boiler room is still there, with its brass valve and its concrete patch. The stairs still have 12 steps. None of that has changed. Tourists still walk past it twice a day, 5 days a week. But underneath all of that, underneath the bricks and the fill and the mud and the clay and whatever the Engstrom family built their unusually deep foundation to contain, there is a corridor that doesn't end. And 4 people are carrying it, and one of them is missing. And the door in all our heads is the same door, and I think it's almost finished.